What happens now? You'll get over heartache. You'll get over heartache.
Segment of our show talk to you about our daughters, our children, our women, even our sons being raped in perpetuity, not just by miscreants, brutal miscreants, but by society, by our institutions, by our elected officials who do not have the sensitivity to understand that there are things you say and that there are things you don't say. To understand that when you make statements such as, there are one or two serial rapists in our midst, that you've got to back it up, that you've got to wake up from your inertia and do something. You know, this evening I'm supposed to have guests, and these guests, they've been very, very patient. They were supposed to have come on last week with me, but we didn't have a show last week, and then they're supposed to come on with me again today. But because of the nature of the subject matter in our first segment, they've graciously asked not to come on and to dedicate the entire show to our young men and women who are being raped over and over and over again. And so I thank them for that. I mean, I had them sit through the first segment, and it's very touching for them. And they just couldn't see themselves coming on after this and watering down the subject. So I thank them profusely for allowing us this moment. You know, I've recently come across a story by a young woman who was raped when she was about 12 or 13. This is a woman who is about in her 30s now. She's in her late 30s, and she was raped, and at the age of between the ages of 12 and 13. And she says that while in school, she was asked, her class was asked to write about the worst day in their lives. And as a child, not really fully understanding or accepting the magnitude of what had happened to her or what was continuing to happen to her, she wrote a story about the first day her stepfather raped her. And she handed in that story to her teacher. And she had written that story, that essay, in such vivid description that the teacher wasn't sure whether it was fact or fiction. So the teacher, not knowing what to do, not being trained to handle that kind of situation, took the essay to her principal. And the principal of the school, dare I say, not knowing what to do herself, called the student in with the teacher. And the student said, and the principal asked the student, "Why would you write a story like that?" And she said, "Why wouldn't I write a story like that? We were instructed to write about the worst day of our lives. That was the worst day of my life. It happened to me." And the principal asked for the mother to be brought in. And the mother was brought in. And the situation was relayed to the mother, and she assured the principal and the teacher that she would take care of it. And the young lady continues on to say that when she got home, she got the beating of her life. She had thought that being raped by her stepfather was the worst thing that could have happened to her, not being believed by her mother, and then being whipped to an inch of her life proved that she was mistaken. She had preempted what was to be the worst day of her life. And her mother then accused her of being womanish and wanting to ruin her relationship with her man and wanting the man for herself. This is a 13-year-old, a barely 13-year-old, just having crossed over from 12. And you're telling her as her mother that the reason she's doing what she's doing or saying what she's saying is because she wants to ruin the relationship that you, the mother, have with a man who is brutalizing your daughter, and for that daughter to wanting that man, to having designs on that man. This is what we're dealing with in this country. And there are so many more stories. So many more stories. Not too long ago, last month, we heard of an 11-year-old child, an 11-year-old baby. I called my 11-year-old niece a baby. I said, come here, baby. She's my baby. You know, she's my baby. And this 11-year-old is 5-6 months pregnant. Gone to the hospital. I don't hear one doctor who had called the police. We know, the family knows who the perpetrator is. Do we know that this young man has been hauled before the courts? Do we? Now what about those where we don't know who the father is? Where the children actually give birth in our publicly funded hospitals. And not a word, not a word, not a word from the nurses or the doctors. Not a word, not a word, not a word from the teachers. Not a word, not a word, not a word from the parents, from the community. And then we want to cast aspersions on others. We have a log in our eyes. And we want to blow out a speck of dust in somebody else's eye. In the first segment, I said to you that we have on average 50 to 60 rapes a year in this country. My question is, how many of those rapes are 1, detected, 2, prosecuted, 3, how many of those rapists are serving time? Did you know, St. Lucia, that on our law books, the maximum sentence, the maximum jail time for rape is life? When was the last time we heard a rapist being brought to justice and being sentenced to life? We have people on remand, which means they have not yet had the day in court for over 13 years, 15 years, for stealing underwear off a line, not being able to afford bail, and yet in the own words of our Prime Minister, there are 1 or 2 serial rapists in our midst. What does that mean? What does that mean? Who are the rapists? The serial rapists, nonetheless. And in whose midst are they? I interviewed Honorable Emma Hippolyte a couple months ago, and she admonished me. She told me that I have a responsibility. I have a responsibility in how I bring out what I see to the masses. And I said to her, yes, I have a responsibility. And I am going to take that responsibility very seriously. But if she meant that I had to cushion the blow, and that I had to powder it and perfume, none of that takes us anywhere. None of that does us any good. None of it. None of it. I had a family member who was raped, and I remember it like it was yesterday. I was only about 9 or 10 years old. And I remember hearing that word for the first time. I lived a very sheltered life. I could not watch movies on telly or on video without my parents having watched it first to ensure that the content matter was appropriate for my age. So I had no clue what that meant. I thought she just fell and hurt herself, and so she couldn't come to school for a few days because she was ill. She'd hurt herself and she couldn't come to school. Not until I was older, much, much, much older, did I understand the import of what had happened to that relative of mine. I never understood until I was in my early 20s, and that's not a lie. That's not a joke. I did not understand, not until my early 20s, what had really actually happened to her. Not that at that age I did not know what rape was. But until I had experienced a few things, did I understand the magnitude of what rape was. And when I see my cousin today trying barely to keep her head above water, it breaks my heart. It breaks my heart. Because as sensitive as I was back then, I could not be any comfort to her because I couldn't understand. I did not understand. And I don't think the guy who did this to her, the beast who did this to her, ever spent one day in jail. Years later, decades later, as a matter of fact, about 5 years ago, I discovered that not one, but 2 more of my classmates had been raped, continuously, brutalized, continuously by family members. I mean, what do you say? And I remember when one of those girls came out with her story. She came out with that story in a fantastic way. And I say fantastic because that girl never, I shouldn't say never because I don't know for sure. But from all accounts, from the outside looking into her life, she never allowed this to keep her down. She built herself and she fought her demons. She said so. She fought her demons. But when she was ready to come out, she came out in a fantastic way. This girl came out internationally. She came out on Oprah, nonetheless. On Oprah. And she came out and she's been doing fantastic things in Canada. And she's just not stopping. She's a powerhouse. She's there for other women and other girls and young women who are going through what she went through. What she went through alone. And I applaud her for that. I applaud her for that. It could not have been an easy thing. And I remember feeling bruised. And I remember thinking, Oh my gosh, she was one of those kids. You know, kids could be mean without really meaning to be. And I remember one September, she came back to school. She'd had a mishap over the summer holidays. And she was teased mercilessly. And she took it like a trooper. All the while, that was happening to her. She was being molested by a family member. That was happening to her. And she suffered in silence. She went on to be a professional, A-list in her game. She's done so many things. She's remarkable. She's using her story. She's not being silenced anymore. She's using her story to reach out and help others. What is your contribution? What are you doing to help others? Do you even care that there are those among you who cannot speak out because they don't know how to? They're not believed. RIP, raped in perpetuity, not just about the physical act of rape alone, but it's when the justice system lets you down, when you cannot have your day in court to face your perpetrator, when you do not have closure of knowing that this punk is getting his just rewards. That is being raped in perpetuity. When your government officials refuse to do anything to help you when they've promised you that they're going to, that is being raped in perpetuity. When you have insensitive government officials whom, instead of dealing with the subject matter at hand, will try to cast aspersions on the media, as if the media is playing up a pesky little issue, that is being raped in perpetuity. Do you care, St. Lucia? Do you care that the sons of Fair Helen are raping the daughters of Fair Helen? Do you care? We're due for a break. When we come back, the lines will be opened to you. You can call us on 451-9788. You could send me your WhatsApp messages on 284-6536. Or you can send me your emails at laurajapierre@gmail.com. See you on the other side of the break.
What happened